So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
Persistence of vision.
Ladies and gentlemen, inspiring conversations in the four corners of the globe and in outer space and at the bottom of the ocean. This is Persistence of Vision.
Hello, folks. I'm Lance Fever Myers.
Hello, folks. I'm LB Dio.
You should go to our website right now if you haven't already. It is POV-Publishing.com. Even if you have gone already, go again. You can read comics and essays and poetry and that sort of thing. And you can also follow links to past podcasts and links to go purchase my book, which is called Why So Much by Lance Myers. You can also purchase LB's book called The Goddamn Fool by LB, of course.
Dio. Yes, of course.
So,
of course.
Once again, we're here to talk about a book, and we have a guest. LB, tell us who this guest is.
We always talk about books, don't we? What the hell's wrong with us?
I don't know, man.
We're here with Mocha Washburn, one of the great rock and roll stars, mixed martial arts fighters, and Hawaiian transplants that I've ever encountered in my short life. So he's going to talk to us about a book called A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius by none other than Dave Eggers, whose email address you may have. Mocha, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
It's good to have you here, man. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's been a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So this book, it's been one of my favorites for a while. Why did you choose it?
So this book in particular was sort of a turning point for me in what literature could be. Previous to this, it was either pop literature, some of the light YA stuff, or you had some tongue-in-cheek stuff like Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's trilogy, etc. Then there was like the serious stuff like Lord of the Rings, or any of sort of like the great classics, that I was reading in high school, like Moby Dick, and can't think of the name, the Heart of Darkness. There we go.
Oh, okay.
We've talked about all those books on our show.
That's right.
I seriously doubt that.
We have.
Have you really?
We haven't. We've touched on Lord of the Rings, but not had
Heart of Darkness. I think that's come
we
up
talked
once
about
or
it
twice.
at length in the context of discussing other shows.
Yes.
Yeah, so that was sort of my background for what literature was, and I was looking for a book, and this is when I was living in LA, and I was dating a woman that worked at a bookstore and asked her for a recommendation, and this is what she recommended, and it sort of broke open my concepts of like what a book could be, what literature could be, and what a writer could be, essentially.
About what year
tell
was
us
this?
more about
What's
that.
the time frame here?
2003.
Okay.
Wow.
2002, 2003, somewhere in there.
So the book hadn't been out very long.
No, only a couple of years.
Yeah. Okay.
This is before our super intern Union Brooks was even born.
Is that accurate? I didn't think so. Yeah.
Pretty close. Pretty close.
So okay. So what grabbed you about it? Like I stepped on
tell
LB's
us.
question, but yes, he's wanting to know why. Like what is it about this book that sort of redefined what you saw literature could be?
So the concept of meta humor wasn't really a thing back then, at least in the way that it is now, right? We have like the Deadpool movies now. We have the Zombieland movies, and there's like a meta humor aspect to that where there's a lot of fourth wall breaking. There's a lot of joking about joking, essentially,
Yes.
right? So and a lot of ironic humor in all
Sure.
of that stuff that's funny because it's not funny, or sort of poking fun at oneself specifically. And that kind of humor wasn't really as much. I mean, it existed, obviously. It's not like there's anything new under the sun, right? But it wasn't sort of culturally available or culturally relevant at the time.
Yeah.
And this book is like essentially my first contact with like really good meta humor, but it's also, just the title, right? A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius. It's both ironic and humorous, but it's also scarily accurate.
Yeah.
Because it is heartbreaking. It is sort of groundbreaking in terms of writing. So it is, a work of staggering genius in that sense.
Right.
But it's the author sort of poking fun at himself and at sort of literature tropes of titles and everything.
Yes.
So that whole sort of just the title itself sort of encapsulates everything that's really relevant about that book.
And you crack it open, and the very first thing you read is the preface, right?
Yeah,
Which
the preface
that in of itself is a genius piece of writing, I think.
Right. Yeah. So, like, I'll just share the first one of the first pages, not literally the first page, but this is rules and suggestions for enjoyment of this book. Number 1, there is no overwhelming need to read the preface. Really. It exists mostly for the author and those who, after finishing the rest of the book, have for some reason found themselves stuck with nothing else to read. If you have already read the preface and you wish you had not, we apologize. We should have told you sooner. Number 2, there is also no overreaching need to read the acknowledgement section. Many early readers of this book, see page XLV, suggested its curtailment or removal, but they were defied. Still, it is not necessary to the plot in any major way. So, as with the preface, if you have already read the acknowledgement section and wish you had not, again, we apologize. We should have said something. Number 3, you can also skip the table of contents if you're short of time. Number 4, actually, many of you might want to skip much of the middle, namely pages 239 through 351, which concern the lives of people in their early 20s, and those lives are very difficult to make interesting, even when they seem interested to those living them at the time. 5, matter of fact, the first 3 or 4 chapters are all some of you might want to bother with. That gets you to page 123 or so, which is a nice length, a nice novella sort of length. Those first 4 chapters stick to one general subject, something manageable, which is more than what can be said for the rest of the book thereafter. 6, the book thereafter is kind of uneven.
I think you're onto something there with how revolutionary this is. Now, I mean, you also, of course, admit there's like nothing new. So, I mean, people, the work that comes to mind for me is like the thing that led up to this, or the thing that sort of broke it open for me was Breakfast of Champions. Like Vonnegut seemed to have done a little bit of this, but I think you're right in that this is the first time, for me too, anyway, as a reader, that I saw it taken to such lengths and done so well, and also done in a voice of like a very modern, contemporary voice that sort of encapsulates this like voice of irony of our contemporary culture.
Yeah, and the set and setting of it, of course, is also what really allows for that to be, what allows for that framing, for that sort of meta humor to actually come forward. So this is like a semi-autobiographical book for those who may not be familiar with it.
Yes, it's characterized as a memoir in the introduction.
Right, and the issue with it is that it sort of spans so many different types of literature that it can be found in many different sections of a given bookstore.
Right, yeah.
Every bookstore is going to have it in a different place. So it's essentially a memoir, but it has fictionalized elements in it. Fictionalized in the sense that elements of the actual story that are happening are used as sort of the narrator's own internal debate with himself. And so something that may be happening in that book, for example, will shortly sort of break the walls of the actual narrative itself and turn into sort of a more almost metaphysical rumination on the author's situation or position in what's happening. The general arc of the story is about Dave, and it's literally Dave Eggers. Or again, memoir, so large parts are based essentially on fact. And his parents both died of cancer within about 6 months of each other. Right. And this would have been 89, 90-ish. Mm-hmm. And he had 2 other siblings close to the same age as him. So he was approximately 20 years old at the time. And both of his other siblings were a little bit older than him, but still close to the same age. And then his younger brother, who was 10.
Toph.
Right.
Yeah.
Christopher Toph.
Yeah.
And so Toph was, the baby of the family and lost both of his parents within 6 months of each other.
Yeah.
And so the book...
We're talking about a character who is suffered 3 major tragedies we've already heard about, which is both of his parents dying and his name is Topher.
Jesus. So poor Toph. So anyway, this was all in Chicago, like where the Eggers sort of grew up, essentially. And that's like the first chapter of the book is the family experience of having his parents die within 6 months of each other.
Right.
And then from then on, it's basically him and his brother having transplanted to the West Coast, to San Francisco.
So he takes up the mantle of the parent role for Toph. He agrees, while his older siblings are busy with their careers and whatnot, he decides to drop out of school and take care of his brother.
Right. And there's, it's not that his other siblings didn't help, take care of Toph.
Yeah.
That was some of the sort of background that came out after the book itself. So for those who don't know, Dave's sister, her name is Beth, and she features in the book somewhat.
Right.
She ended up committing suicide.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it wasn't that long ago. I mean, that long ago in my years, right? Because I swear 2004 was like 2 years ago. But
Yeah. That I did not know that.
yeah, so unfortunate. But I know that she felt that Dave sort of overstated his role in helping parent and raise Toph, which I think that's fair in the sense that it's Dave's memoir, right? So he's writing about himself primarily.
Well, and they do move in with her, right? They live with Beth. Is it Beth that they live with at first when they moved to the West Coast?
I believe so, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, and Beth does, like, her wedding is part of the book itself when she got married and everything.
Yeah.
His older brother didn't really figure in as much. So I know that Beth is involved there somewhat.
Yeah.
But so the way the memoir reads, Dave is largely responsible for, of course, his younger brother's upbringing and being his caregiver.
Right.
But it's all hijinks and shenanigans as soon as that starts, right? So it has this really sort of profound and almost elegiac start in that it's it's a tragedy. It's a sort of a family starting from a very dark, deep place.
The account of his mother with the stomach cancer, it just haunts me. It's really dark and very, very difficult.
It's almost certainly the most horrifying description of a disease that I've ever read in my life.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, but starting from such a powerful place, right? Like when I first started reading this, I was like, ooh, I don't know if I'm going to like this.
Yeah.
Like this is just really intense. It's more intense than I had anticipated initially. But then it turns into like a Bugs Bunny cartoon after that for like the remainder of the novel, except when it's not, right?
Yeah.
There are the personal frustrations that come up for all of the characters. There's sort of the fear, the parenting fear that I hear arises. Now, I personally am not a parent, but there's, when this happens, Dave is in his early 20s. So he still wants to be a young person doing young people things. He wasn't intending to be a parent, right? So I'm going to get a babysitter and go out with my friends. And as soon as he leaves the house, he's thinking about serial killers chopping up his little brother.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's that sort of exaggerated sense of his own personal responsibility when it comes to a lot of that.
Right.
But then, of course, the way that he states it is hilarious.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it's him, working on his career. And this is early, 90s San Francisco, the height of the .com period, right? And sort of, as he states, it's the white-hot center of culture at the time. Which is fairly accurate. I mean, Seattle and San Francisco were both kind of the cultural centers of what was going on. What was it, season 2 of The Real World?
Yeah, something like that.
It was one of the early seasons of The Real World, but it's the most popular season, right? It's the San Francisco season with Puck and with Pedro and all of that. And he was actually auditioning for that. Yeah. And it's in the book, right? That's another part where he takes the audition. So he's, getting interviewed by the producers. And he'd already sent in his audition tape and he got the actual interview and everything, right? And so this one of the middle chapters is just the quote unquote interview, like the audition that he's going through. Yeah. And and that's where he starts pulling out of character and starts drawing attention to the fact that he's pulling out of character. You're going to have a lot of these back and forth discussions, which are like, that seems a little bit too like metaphysical for an actual like interview to get on a TV program. And then he draws attention to it by saying, in character, because it's a dialogue essentially, right? It's like, producer Dave, and the way it's written is like a script in terms of the lines. And so it's like, producer, this isn't very much like the actual interview at all, is it?
Right.
Dave, nope, not at all. Not actually anything like this, right?
Yeah.
So that's where, that happens several times throughout the book, and that's the first time when it really caught me on the chin.
Right.
And I was reading this in a cafe in Hollywood, and everyone thought I was a lunatic because I would just start bursting out laughing in the middle of the cafe for no reason.
What strikes me is that, okay, so to describe something like that, it can, those kinds of things can come off as just obnoxious and like kind of just annoying and cutesy. But it's like what Shannon McCormick said about Infinite Jest. He said, in the hands of someone less capable, it would be a disaster. It's like, Dave Eggers, his writing prowess just brings it like to a masterful level. It's really fantastic the way he handles that, because that in and of itself can be really, really obnoxious. But his writing of it and his capturing of that in this book is just beautiful, I think.
What it reminds me of is the scene in Annie Hall where someone is discussing Marshall McLuhan in a movie theater line, and Woody Allen says, "You're crazy. That's not at all what Marshall McLuhan says." And he says, "Just listen," and he grabs Marshall McLuhan from off screen. Yeah. Marshall McLuhan's like, "You know nothing of my work."
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. But and I'm not a huge fan of all of Dave Eggers' work, but this one really shows that the dude knows how to write, and he knows how to write in this particular style just so well.
Yeah, and it's funny for me because of course I read, I've become a big Dave Eggers fan, and I've read a bunch of his stuff after this. The one after this, directly after this, chronologically, was And You Shall Know Our Velocity. And I also think that's a virtuosic piece of writing. It didn't land the same way for me.
Yeah.
I would say that my two other favorite books after this that he did were What is the What and Zaytoon. And for different reasons. So What is the What is the story of one of the lost boys of the Sudan, like back in the early 80s when there was that humanitarian crisis, right? And much like this, it's embellished in the sense that the story is not just that one character's story. He uses elements from other stories of the lost boys of the Sudan and incorporates them into this one character's narrative. But what he does, which is such a difficult thing to do, and I've seen it just absolutely mangled by lesser authors, is he actually changes his voice because he takes on the voice of this character, the actual person. And there are only hints of like Dave Eggers, a couple of turns of phrase where I'm like, that's very Eggers, right?
Yeah.
But the rest of it was totally subsumed by the voice of the main character itself. And that is really challenging to do.
Yes.
There was, I saw like an example of how not to do it, right? There's that Chuck Palahniuk novel, Haunted, I think. Yeah. So
not a fan.
Okay, how not to do it.
Yeah. So, well, I went through a Palahniuk phase, right? Okay. So I read, Fight Club, Invisible Monsters, et cetera. There were 3 or 4 in there that I read, and I got an advanced copy of Haunted. I believe it's called Haunted. And the whole thing is a writer's workshop. And so it's a bunch of writers that have decided to come together in a workshop, and they're sequestered in this workshop, and then they find out just how sequestered they are, and they all start eating each other. So, right. So already it's like, if you know the overview, you're like, nah, I don't know about this, right?
Yeah.
But the point of like what he does is he has each of these authors, like the story that they're writing, right, while they're all sequestered, and that's how you get to know the characters. But they all sound like Chuck Palahniuk.
Right, gotcha.
And so with something like What is the What, Dave Eggers doesn't sound like Dave Eggers, right? He sounds like someone else. And then Zaytoon is just a really straightforward, like very serious, like just biographical account of namesake character, who's I don't believe it's his first name, maybe his last name, I can't remember. It's Zaytoun. He's actually a Syrian immigrant,
Right.
And this was all during like his experience during Hurricane Katrina, living in New Orleans. And so Dave does not do any of the humor pyrotechnics with that, right?
Right.
For him, it's a very somber reading because this poor guy, as a Syrian immigrant and a contractor who had his own contracting business and was working in the local area, helping build homes, et cetera, stayed during Hurricane Katrina. And then in the aftermath was helping his neighbors, rescued one of his neighbors they had a dinghy, he and a couple of friends, right? And he ended up getting arrested by the police, and it turned out, it actually turned into a federal investigation.
Wow.
Because they assumed that he was a terrorist.
Huh.
Syrian immigrant. And he had a friend that was also Middle Eastern. I don't recall if his friend was Syrian or not, but his friend had a bunch of cash that he had basically saved for emergencies. Didn't keep it in a bank, kept it in a bag. And so when the cops show up, when they actually when they come back into the city and they're trying to help reestablish order and everything, they run into these guys who've just basically been helping out their neighborhoods. And one of them's got a bag of cash and a couple of them are Middle Eastern. They're like, oh, they must be terrorists.
Yeah.
And so it was.
Wait, they weren't?
I mean, this is the Bush era, right? So, but the end result from all of that was that he ended up having to, he was arrested, didn't get a phone call, anything like that. He dropped off the map. Like he just went into this black hole of law enforcement. And his family had left town. They couldn't get in touch with them. His wife was losing her hair because she was so stressed out. His kids were not able to sleep. And it's just a travesty of justice and how that happens. And so here's an author who, nails this particular style of humor.
Yeah.
But at the same time has enough flexibility to not do that. So he does it when it's useful and when it works. And when it's not something that works, he just steps away from it.
Yes. That is what makes him one of the more interesting authors out there. And almost like a cultural phenomenon because he established McSweeney's as well.
Yes.
Which is huge. And I think that's actually how I think I was reading McSweeney's before I even knew who Dave Eggers was, And,
I think I heard about them at the same time. Like, this guy, Dave Eggers, who does this magazine called McSweeney's and blah, blah, blah. And you got to check it out. And it was like this huge thing in the 90s. And it's still going, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
But
the online thing is
he's truly
really
one
huge.
of the writers of the moment in his time, right? I mean, he was not just another writer. He was viewed as one of the best and the brightest. And that was like sort of a core of what his whole image was. I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he started a magazine right in the 90s, Might.
That's covered in the book.
Like,
actually, no, it was Might. You're right.
Yeah,
MIGHT.
And so that's where he sort of got it going as a writer and as sort of a cultural analyst or a cultural, helping sort of establish that sort of humor culture in magazine form for what eventually became McSweeney's. And then he's got the online thing that's sort of like an Onion, almost an Onion type, humor.
All the humor articles on
it's
McSweeney's,
wonderful. It's fantastic. But Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius was his first book, and it was, I think, a runner-up for a Pulitzer.
Yeah, let's look at this. It was a Pulitzer Prize finalist.
Right.
A finalist.
Yeah, and again, as you said, his first novel.
Right. Yeah.
Which
it's interesting for me because it kind of paralleled my own life where I came back to New York to do a magazine called Jinx. And just at the same time, I heard about McSweeney's. And so I'm like doing this tiny little obscure nothing zine, and McSweeney's is getting bigger and bigger, and then this book comes out, and I'm like, who is this damn bitch?
Yeah, well, so, and of course, as you mentioned, McSweeney's like the online version is mostly humor articles, but the actual publication itself, I believe it's a quarterly, right?
Right,
Something like that.
Yeah.
And they collect some of the best authors that you've never heard of.
And it's so good. And it's authors from around the world. And it's so good. And it's interesting, too. One of the things that drew me into it, I think actually the thing that made me pick it up and start reading was every book is a work of art. I mean, the way they publish it, the artwork on the covers, the format. Sometimes they do like I think one of the quarterly publications was a box full of a bunch of little pamphlets.
That are a mosaic.
Yeah.
And let me even, because the one that you're talking about, right, there's actually a personal connection that I have to that one. My younger brother has a story published in that one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Which that one, what was it called? Eaters of the Ocean or something like that. But yes, that particular quarterly, the one where you have all the little pamphlets that you pull out and everything. My brother has one of those pamphlets.
That's so great.
One of his stories.
That's very cool.
So he actually...
I'm so jealous.
Free plug.
That's
free plug here for him. So he had three short stories that were published in major outlets. And I say major, I mean, for writers, right?
Oh, well, yeah. McSweeney's is huge.
Right. So that was his second story, actually.
Wow.
His first one was called Tantalus, and that was published in the Mid-Atlantic Review.
Okay.
And then he had that one in McSweeney's, and then the one after that was called On the Swish and Roar.
Okay.
And that one was, I don't remember where that was initially published because there ended up being a paywall there when he sent me the link, and I was like, I mean, come on, man. I just want to read your story. I don't want to pay for it. I'm your family, damn it. But I ended up, it's on Amazon now.
Okay.
And it's like $2.
What's his
Amazon.
name?
Kawai Strong Washburn.
Okay.
But Kawai is spelled Kawai. So, of course, we're from Hawaii.
Yeah.
The Hawaiian W is pronounced like a V. It's like a German W, basically.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, and in the way that you mentioned, this book changed what you thought literature could do. There were a lot of stories in a lot of these quarterlies where I would just like devour these and just be like, man, I that's kind of in a broad sense, like this whole production, this whole thing that they're doing with the quarterly has changed my idea of what you can do with
literature,
and with books and with all of it.
That same story, the one that was in McSweeney's, was actually published in the Best American Non-Required Reading as well. And his first novel, my younger brother's first novel, is coming out March 31st of next year, March 31st, 2020. It's being published in 8 languages.
Wow.
And it's called Sharks in the Time of Saviors.
I love it.
So we're a bunch of nerds, basically. All we do is read.
Nerd alert.
Nerd alert.
Nerd alert.
Well, you're in good company. Well, that's fantastic. What's our time here?
Well, we could do the lightning round.
All right. You ready?
I think so.
Okay. Lightning round it is. Here we go. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. When was the first
time?
Do you remember falling in love with the book for the very first time?
Yeah, that would actually be The Lord of the Rings. I had it wasn't published as one book; it was 3 separate volumes. Though I got like the one volume later, but that would have been in the middle of high school. Well, towards the end, so I would have been a senior in high school. Actually, that would have been 1996.
Great answer. Has a book ever changed your mind about anything?
Yeah, actually. So I majored in philosophy. And I took this class on 20th century contemporary philosophy, which is basically just French postmodernism.
Okay.
And we were reading Michel Foucault. It was Discipline and Punish. And I was definitely farther right on the political spectrum than I am now. I was kind of like a centrist liberal where I was like, yeah, sure, death penalty. Why not? Some people deserve it. And the opening chapters of Discipline and Punish are an account, a first and second person account of a man who was drawn and quartered. And it was really hard for me to read. And I immediately changed my views on capital punishment after having read that and after having read Discipline and Punish, to where sort of if someone doesn't have their own body, if someone doesn't have command of themselves, they don't have command of anything.
Right.
And I don't believe that the state in any way has the right to take that away from people. And that specifically changed because of that book and the introduction, like the first chapter of that book. It was really hard for me to read.
That's a great answer.
Discipline and Punish, mother effer.
Has a book ever changed your life?
Good question. I would say probably there was this book here, Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, and there was also the Cheese Monkeys that I read shortly after. Similar in terms of the type of humor, but Cheese Monkeys is a little bit more of a contained story, and the timeline is different. It's like in the 50s, essentially. It's a kid in art school or in college, in a university studying art. And really, this kind of opened my idea to what humor could be. So I would definitely say that this changed my life in that it allowed me to sort of explore what humor means to me, like what is actually humorous, what I find entertaining.
That's great.
For me, it's funny stuff mostly.
Has a book ever made you cry on the opposite end of the spectrum?
Right. So I'm going to give a partial answer on this one, which is, I wouldn't say a book, but a short story.
Okay.
And actually, it was On the Swish and Roar. It was my brother's story.
The one that you didn't want to pay for?
The one that I didn't want to pay for, right. And ended up paying for anyway.
You paid in tears, my friend.
Yeah, exactly. So the short version of that story is that it's about two brothers in a household being raised by a single mom, and it's in Maui. My brother pretty much, his stories are almost exclusively written about Hawaii.
Okay.
Characters from the islands, essentially. Some are in the islands, some are not in the islands at the time, or are reminiscing about when they were in the islands or have to go back to the islands, that kind of stuff. But this one is about one brother who's like an academic star, and his older brother who's an athletic star. And it's really centered around the athletic brother as he runs into some family problems and starts going through a slump in his playing. And he's a basketball player, so it's like, all the college scouts are showing up, and then the scouts stop showing up, and then he's getting benched. And sort of his internal turmoil and processing with sort of not working through what's going on with his family, and then sort of having to work through that in order to get his game back in time for the sort of the huge game of the season. And it's really it has a lot to do with his rivalry with his younger brother, how he feels out of place in his own family. And there was, I don't talk with my brother about his writing process very much, but I saw flashes of us in those characters.
Right. Sure.
And in particular, the main character really, really resonated with me just because of his loneliness. Yeah. And I sort of have always had a lot of loneliness in my own family. I always kind of felt like the piece that didn't fit, you know? Mm-hmm. And so, that story moved me to tears.
Wow. Okay. Good answer. Okay. Name a book you've read more than once.
Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, right? To start.
Okay.
Lord of the Rings, I used to read it annually.
Oh, really?
I don't really have the time to do that these days. Yeah. Neuromancer by William Gibson, one of my all-time favorites. Dune by Frank Herbert.
You are a nerd, aren't you?
Yeah, I am quite the nerd, yes. Yeah. I could keep going, but those are like off the top of my head. Those are ones that I've read multiple times.
Okay, great.
There are also biographies that I've read a few times, et cetera. So.
Okay. And then the $1 million question, the big one. Do you have any poetry committed to memory?
Robert Frost.
Okay.
Fire and ice. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice.
Beautiful. Nicely done. Okay, well, this has been a fantastic interview. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about Dave Eggers. LB's taking a photo. Smile for the camera. Mug with the mic. Hello, hello. Well, thank you so much for being here.
What a treat to have my old pal Mocha Washburn talking books.
Yeah.
Talking philosophy.
Fantastic.
It's great to see you both. It's been far too long, and thank you so much for having me. I really
It's a great reason to get back together. Okay, so this has been the Persistence of Vision podcast. Please do visit our website, POV-Publishing.com. Buy my book, which is called Why So Much. Buy LB's book, which is called The Goddamn Fool. right?
Yes, and it's also about basketball.
That's true. That is true.
So which is better? Which book is better?
Get them
That's what
both.
you have to decide.
Buy them both.
Well,
Buy them both twice.
Yeah, buy all the books. Buy all the books and be our servants and our devoted fans forever.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Thank you.